Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Giovanni Reyes.
And I'm Jennifer Valdez. From unsolved mystery cases to confession tapes and investigations, Americans' appetite for true crime content is exploding.
According to a YouGov survey, nearly half of Americans say they enjoy true crime content, and a third consume it at least once a week. For many years, true crime has been the subject of books, TV shows, movies, documentaries, with a huge consumer base and significant influence.
According to The New Yorker, this fascination is actually centuries old. In the 1800s, newspapers printed detailed accounts of murder, inviting readers to evaluate the evidence for themselves. And now the true crime genre has moved into podcasting. According to Rolling Stone, 10 years ago, podcasts were obscure. Now podcasts are an important part of media landscape, whether they cover a new case every episode or present a story over the course of a season. And many podcasts are about true crime stories.
One example, the first season of Serial, a 2014 podcast that investigated the case of Adnan Syed. Syed was convicted of murdering his former girlfriend Hae Min Lee, but he maintained his innocence. According to NBC News, Serial podcasts changed the game, racking up hundreds of millions of downloads worldwide, renewing the true crime genre and transforming a rising digital format that was both commercially unproven and journalistically untested. In the show's first season, Serial host Sarah Koenig reinvestigated Syed's case, raising urgent questions about the justice system. Eventually, a court threw out Syed's conviction. Prosecutors in Baltimore dropped charges against him, and Syed was released from prison after 22 years, and the podcast was a big reason why.
Some worry true crime stories can be re-traumatizing to survivors and desensitizing to viewers. But why are people drawn to these true crime stories?
And is it healthy for our culture to be so interested in stories about violence and crime? On Point's Renee Torres has more.
Thank you, Giovanni and Jennifer. And today joining us, we have a forensic psychologist, Dr. Scott, from the podcast LA Not So Confidential. He also co-hosts the podcast with Dr. Shiloh. Also today we have Dr. Richard Lettieri, a forensic neuropsychologist and psychoanalyst. We also have Renee Williams. Renee serves as executive director for the National Center for Victims of Crime. And finally, joining us today, we have Kim Goldman. Kim is a victim advocate. She co-chairs the board for the National Center for Victims of Crime. She's a sister of Ron Goldman. Kim is also an author for her book, Media Circus, which later became her podcast. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
I would like to set the stage with this question for you, Dr. Scott. For our audience, can you please explain why true crime has gotten so popular?
There's a lot of discussion about why this genre exploded over the past decade. Podcast became more popular, I'd say, in the last 10 to 12 years. And there are certainly some seminal moments. I think Serial really sort of skyrocketed the entire genre into a level that it had not really met before. And I think Dr. Lettieri could also speak to this as well, but there's something about true crime, much like horror, which can elicit a response in us that is almost like going on a roller coaster. You know, your adrenal glands start squirting out some adrenaline. It's like it's an excited feeling. The context is something that's scary and provocative. And it also melds with this idea of curiosity about human behavior. And not only the human behavior that we see criminals perpetrating on their victims, but also the darker sides of ourselves. I think we're curious, like, how would people do that? How could they be in a place where they would do that to another person? Am I capable of doing that? I think that all of those factors have really contributed to the popularity of this media. And I'm also just glad to say that I see the milieu, the genre itself, shifting in the last couple of years to not glorifying perpetrators. There's been a real shift into being victim-centric and being supportive of the families and not glorifying the acts of these perpetrators.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Lettieri, would you like to add on that? Why has it become so popular?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I really wasn't, until I wrote my book, I wasn't aware of the popularity of true crime podcasts, but I certainly understand it. I think it has to do a lot with curiosity. It's not just a morbid curiosity, it's curious about human beings, about human nature. How could someone do the things? How could anybody do something like that? And also, I think it speaks to people curious about themselves. Like, can I do something like that? I know, in my practice, private practice, from the average individual, a lot of people have fears of going crazy, or of might be something wrong with them that they don't know. And I think this is a way of sort of in a safe way of looking at the darker side of who we are, and trying to get a handle on it.
Okay.
Yeah, Buzz, I forget his first name. He wrote a book on, the murderer next door, and his surveys on this. He's an evolutionary psychologist. Something like 90% of people have had serious fantasies about killing somebody they know.
Yes.
Serious ones, not just, I wish he would die. I mean, serious, like thought through fantasies. But most people don't do it. But I think people, part of true crime is a way of kind of trying to sort of, like it's a virtual, safe way of understanding that piece of other people and themselves. That, that's kind, not an unhealthy thing. I think there's a voyeuristic quality to. We can get into that also, and you can get obsessed with it. But I think fundamentally, there's also a part of it that people trying to understand themselves, and also to feel it's almost like a survival mechanism to kind of get a better handle on how to understand the risks that we all have to predators.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's take a listen to what a few students at CSUN had to say about true crime podcasts.
Well, I started listening to crime podcasts ever since I can remember. I always found that subject really interesting to me, and I found most of them to be because at the end they always end up finding who the serial killer is, so to me that's satisfying. So I'll never go out and watch an unsolved one, because it leaves me very unsettled, because it's the serial killer could still be out there and we don't know who it is.
I think it's fascinating just kind of looking at the backstory. I think there's a lot of commonalities behind a lot of these criminals, and in terms of their upbringing and their mental health. So I think there's a lot of learnings to be had there. And I think it's just interesting to see the sequencing of events and how it's all unfolded.
You could watch it. There's nothing wrong with watching it. It's okay, just sticking your head inside that rabbit hole. But you got to be able to know when to stick it back out and see that, it's not all darkness. There is some light to this world. There's always good stuff happening as well.
Okay, so Dr. Lettieri, why do you think people find true crime so affecting, especially for the students that we just heard?
I thought it was interesting. One of the women there commented that she gets unsettled if it's not solved. I was just asked to be probably do this interview tomorrow on the Idaho issue. Those 4 students, three female students and 1 male who were killed, and it's unsolved. It's very unsettling because of that, because it's the unpredictability and the danger. So that's so people that's again, I think, speaks to people viewing these true crime, especially women, as well, because that as I look at the literature, there's women are very interested in true crime, and it's not a morbidity. I think it's a survival, wanting to see kind of like a survival mechanism. How should I, if I ever get in this situation, how should I deal with it? So there's lots of varied reasons, but I think fundamentally it's kind of a safe look at human nature, of other people, what could be done, what people could do, and of ourselves, of sort of getting closer to that kind of darker side in ourselves in a safe way to try and sort of metabolize it in a way.
Thank you. And Dr. Scott, you immersed yourself into creating true crime content such as LA Not So Confidential. What sparked the idea to create a true crime podcast?
So I have a really, really close friend, and we met in our internships. We were both experiencing midlife careers. I was in entertainment for 20 years and went back to grad school. My co-host, Dr. Shiloh, was a former police officer, and we graduated at the same time and did our internships together. And we just became really close, and we were working in a forensic site. So we were really immersed in working with some sexually violent predators, post and pre-release incarceration predators. And it was new to me. It was fascinating. And I got pulled into it, not really knowing that I would be, first of all, interested in this particular population, but also I had an affinity for it. You know, as a psychologist or a mental health professional, you find areas that really speak to you and that you have a facility for. And then several years later, we both ended up working with law enforcement in different capacities in about a block from each other in downtown LA. We were having coffee, and she said, "Hey, I want to do a podcast." And I said, "Nope, not going to do it. We're too busy, blah, blah, blah." And then within about half a block, she had convinced me to do it because there were no forensic psychologists at the time talking about the motivations behind people who perpetrate these crimes, and really kind of trying to give an audience an understanding of what were the environmental factors. How did this person grow up to be the perfect victim? How did this person grow up to be the perfect predator? And it took off, and here we are 5 years later with a couple of hundred episodes under our belt. And yeah, that's how we got started. We just saw a need and we filled it, and we've gotten a lot of opportunities to really advocate for moving away from glorifying perpetrators. I think that really needs to be the driving message in this genre today, is let's work on learning how to protect the community. And like Dr. Lettieri was saying, is the predominant population that listens to true crime podcasts are women, and also the predominant victims of violent crime in our country are women. So these two things are linked together. Let's find a way to educate people better so that they can be safe in their community.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I didn't know about your podcast, but that it's such an emphasis on really sharing information, education of some of the the dynamics and the history, the developmental abnormalities of so many people, as opposed to this voyeuristic excitement over like Ted Bundy, which could be a bit disturbing.
So, and I want to ask Kim, many of our viewers may recognize you, Kim, from one of the most high-profile murder trials in American history. In 1994, O.J. Simpson was tried on charges he killed your brother, Ron Goldman, and O.J.'s estranged wife, Nicole Brown Simpson. A jury acquitted Simpson of those murder charges, though a civil court later found him liable for their deaths. I wanted to ask you, you created a podcast, Media Circus, in which you have the victims and their families tell their stories in their own words and terms. Why did you decide to change this narrative surrounding true crime storytelling?
Thank you for the question. Because we don't typically get a platform that is a free form for us to be able to share our true emotions, our candid answers, our thoughts, our experiences, our theories, and not have them go through the mainstream media's filter or a detective's filter. The victims and survivors are often cast aside when we do storytelling about high crime or true crime. So it was important for me to give the voice back to the people whose story everyone is consuming anyways, and to really give us the control that was taken from us when our loved ones were killed. So it's important for me to make sure that we're always paying attention to victims and survivors, which is why I'm on the board of the National Center for Victims of Crime, and why it's important for us to make sure that the voices of our community is always the loudest.
Okay, thank you. And Renee, the National Center for Victims of Crime helps victims of crime rebuild their lives. What are your views on true crime content?
The National Center was actually interestingly founded by one of the first big true crime cases that hit the nation, and that was the case of Sunny Von Bulow. There's been a movie out about her life and her subsequent not death, but being put into a coma, and her children were just so appalled by how they were treated, not only within the media, but within the justice system itself, that they started the center. I say all that to say now, true crime can be productive. And my views are on it that it's not going away. But much like Dr. Scott said, there's been a shift recently to focus less on the perpetrators and to romanticize the perpetrators, and that's good. But I think that there's also been a shift. We've never been able to consume true crime in the way that we are able to consume it now, and it's 24/7. And that is leading a drive to look for more salacious material, to be constantly putting things out. And that's a dangerous place to be, because I worry that once again, victims are kind of get shuffled to the side by well-intentioned people who are just trying to get a story out there. And sometimes they're trampling over the victims to get the story out. Now, there are ways to do that in a healthy, productive way. And I think a lot of that in the future is going to be driven by true crime consumers. So going to these media companies and saying, did you work with the victims in this? And requiring that before we watch anything, there's just a note as to whether or not the production company contacted the victim to even let them know that something was coming out. You know, Netflix just released their series on Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yes.
And I don't know that they spoke to the victims' families. And I can say that I cannot imagine being the mother of one of the young men that he killed and having to hear about it again. And at this point, it's becoming more and more for entertainment, and that scares me a little bit.
Yes, thank you. Also, how does media coverage impact victims who are affected by the crimes?
I think it can be great for them. It's certainly a way to get the story out when you can get media coverage, especially when it is a missing, murdered person, and you get the national attention. It becomes easier to find them. But I also think that we forget for the victims and the victims' families that they are humans and they're not characters in a story. And so we tend to just, once they put their lives out there, we think that it's for us to consume their lives, and to judge every move they make and everything they say. And when they say, hey, that's enough, I've had enough, I can't do this anymore, people's reaction is sometimes, well, you're the one that put yourself out there.
Right. Okay, thank you for sharing. Now, Kim, how do you feel ethics comes into play in your opinion as an advocate for victims and family members whose stories reach the media with many opinions surrounding the case?
Well, ethics is an interesting concept because different people have different ethical values and different ethical intentions. So my set of ethics might be different than, the mainstream media producer who needs to make sure they hit the marks for the night and get, clicks and tweets and shares. So I think to Renee's point, that there can be some useful uses when you're consuming true crime. As we've both said, it's not going anywhere. So now we need to kind of educate people how to be consumers and how to be sensitive and respectful, knowing that you are consuming and watching someone's most horrific moments unfold for your own personal entertainment. You get to turn that off and you get to click on to the next story. We're still sitting in our stuff. So I think if we start to shift the narrative in terms of how you can be a more discerning listener, how you can be more productive in your community, how you can be a volunteer, how you can be more involved in advocacy, I think we can start to allow ourselves to be more responsible as we are consumers, and maybe that will sort of elicit a more ethical approach as we tell the stories, because as Renee said, it's not going anywhere, and we have an insatiable appetite in our country, and there are more and more streaming opportunities and places for content to be consumed. So I think we need to start having conversations which give people the tools to pay attention in a more responsible and sensitive manner.
Thank you. And Dr. Lettieri, I would like to ask you, from a psychology standpoint, do you think listening to stories about violent crimes, sometimes gruesome incidents, is healthy?
Generally, I think people are watching and listening to these podcasts, like I said, for a variety of reasons, a lot of them healthy reasons and a lot of survival reasons. But I think you could get a certain cohort, a certain group of people who have bring to the podcast problems already that it could exacerbate. It could aggravate anger. It could aggravate anger towards women. It could be the intentions of someone with a thinking disturbance or someone with some kind of abnormal psychology already that could be problematic. I want to just go back to like the ethical issues too that were coming up like that with Kim that you brought up and you experienced. Would it be naive, and maybe Dr. Scott could talk this, is naive to think of, in some ways, since podcasts are becoming so ubiquitous, so many of them, to begin for the organizers or people involved in more to begin organizing some kind of ethical standards or guidelines for people who do it, as opposed to just hoping that the public, because some of the public will respond. And I think, like Dr. Scott said, there's maybe more of an emphasis than there was at the beginning of these issues on glorifying a perpetrator, that there's more of a sensitivity to that, but maybe in some organized way for that to be pushed even further.
Well, I'll speak. Renee's going to say this too. There are avenues out for your viewing at this point that you can learn how to be a more ethical consumer. There's trauma-informed journalism, there's training, there's ways for the media to learn how to be respectful and responsive to victims. I know that the Victim Center, we're working on some policies around that, and some seminars and some tools to train, because it's kind of a free-for-all right now, because we have so many different places where we're consuming between social media and all the armchair detectives and everybody with the camera becoming now a journalist. It's gotten a little out of control. And so, I love that the National Center is going to be on the front lines of doing some really productive work in that space. I also have some things I'm working on alluding to what Renee said in terms of maybe some legislation and maybe something to help kind of curb some of the attitudes out there that just use our stories at their free will. And I don't know, there's a movement because we're not getting away from it. And I'm happy for that. I'm sad for all of the injustice and all the pain that's being caused, but I do think that sometimes, as we know, good things can come out of that. So I don't know, Renee, if you want to speak to what the center's doing, but.
Okay. And actually, Renee, I have a question for you. In today's day and age, true crime content is widely accessible. How does the spread of misinformation affect the victims of the crimes?
We actually just had a panel on this at our big national conference, and Kim actually moderated that, so she can chime in with some of the opinions. I think that there's a specific true crime case that I'm thinking of that podcasters and armchair sleuths have put out false information that have truly impacted this family. And I actually can't say anything because I'm afraid of being sued for defamation, because this particular podcaster has threatened many people. So I'm not going to say names, but this person put out a theory that the father of this family was doing something untoward towards this young woman. And just the father had to answer for that. So he's in the middle of mourning his daughter. And this misinformation is coming out that has no basis in reality. And so he's being asked these questions that are just horrible and that no person should ever have to answer. And so I think we see it there just with victims' families, the constant explosion of people saying what could have happened, what did happen. It impacts their psyche. But I think we also need to consider very truly that we're impacting investigations. And so on that panel I mentioned, we had an FBI agent who is also a true crime podcaster. And he talked about how once we start hearing these new tips and everything, it wastes time and it throws off investigations completely. I think everybody's probably very familiar with this point with Alex Jones and the disinformation he was spreading about Sandy Hook and how that impacted families. And I think that's actually a tremendous trial to go back and watch pieces of, because victims' families talked about how it really did impact them deeply. And Alex Jones at the time thought, he was just spewing hatred, and I'm sure he thought he wasn't hurting anybody. But there were I
don't think he cared.
Yeah.
Fair.
I'm going to go on the record. He did not care who he hurt.
I don't disagree. But I don't think he even, I think we've gotten into a society where we just say things. We just say it. And we don't think of the long-term impacts, especially if we're behind a keyboard or behind a computer screen.
Absolutely. Thank you, Renee. And Dr. Scott, what do you hope for your listeners to gain after tuning into your episodes?
our listeners, it's very interesting. There's a concept called parasocial relationships within the podcast community, where one of the things that drives people to listen to any genre of podcast is the relationship between the hosts. And you develop a relationship with the people that you're listening to. And maybe one genre is your cup of tea and one isn't. And I offer that as a framework for saying that our podcast, we have amazing listeners and we interact with our listeners a lot. We're not a huge podcast, but sometimes we get a little academic and that turns people off because we're not doing the salacious stuff. But we have, what I hope is that people will not just learn something, but I mean, there's an intellectual and cognitive elevation of learning, and there's also an emotional IQ development. And I want people to come away with the idea that this is not black and white in many ways. It's very, very complex. And the example I use is that all of us can have compassion for a child that has been horrifically abused, beaten, traumatized, multiple brain injuries, exposed to sexual materials, sexually abused, brought up in an environment of crime. We can all have incredible compassion for that person. But 15 years later, when that person turns into Richard Ramirez, who commits a series of awful crimes, we have to shift our thinking, right? So I hope to lead our listeners into complexity and understanding that there's a gray area for this. It's not a black and white issue, and that people need to be ethical in their listening as well as ethical in their production of this material.
Absolutely. Thank you. And that's all we have for today. I would like to thank all of you for meeting here with me and talking about true crime podcasts. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're watching On Point. We'll be right back.
There's so many rewards in life. You coming into our home was one of the greatest rewards we could have ever had.
You know, it took 20 years and I got my third child who was 17 at the time.
It's so cool to watch the adult that you've become, and you really have done as much for us as you think we've done for you.
Thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on social media at CSUN On Point.
You can hear us on KCSN 88.5 FM on Sunday mornings at 5:30. You can watch us on LA 36 and Santa Clarita Valley Television.
For all of us here on Point, I'm Giovanni Reyes.
And I'm Jennifer Valdez.